This is Lee Smith. I'm a water resources engineer and project manager based in ECT's Tallahassee office. I know some of you folks out there today. I really appreciate everybody taking time to join us, and I think you'll find it very worthwhile. For those who may not be familiar with ECT, we're a Florida-based full-service environmental consulting firm with 7 offices across the state and a dozen offices elsewhere in various places in mostly the eastern United States. Our professionals have been engaged in the Restore Act process since its inception at the local, the state, and federal levels, and we've served in a variety of key roles in large-scale ecological restoration efforts, both in Florida and elsewhere historically. Next, please. Just to help set the table for today's webinar, I'll mention that we are not going to spend time on the basics of understanding the Restore Act today. If you think you might benefit from that kind of overview, we did cover that pretty thoroughly in our kickoff to our webinar series on February 8th of this year. And that is available for independent viewing at your leisure through our Restore Act webpage at the address that you should be seeing on your screen now. Today's webinar will also be recorded for later viewing, and a video link will be available on that same web page within the next few working days in case you'd like to go back and review a particular topic, or if you'd like to share the information with a colleague. And we hope you'll do that. To introduce you to today's speakers, as I mentioned, my name is Lee Smith, and today I'll be providing a brief update on the status of the Restore Act process and talking about some things that we see the more proactive Restore Act stakeholders doing now, particularly at the local level. Most of my efforts in Restore Act work these days involve working with coastal community stakeholders to help them develop good projects for funding requests. Back up one slide, if you would, please, Jenny. I'll be followed by Jeff Edstrom, who has worked extensively on regional restoration projects in the Great Lakes Basin, and Jeff will be talking about some lessons learned from those experiences that we think can be applied in developing great regional programs on the Gulf Coast. Jeff Smith is a project scientist with ECT, and he will be talking today about some examples of high-value coastal restoration projects that have been done here in Florida with the involvement of a wide range of stakeholders and multiple funding sources. And finally, we'll be joined by John Abendroth, who recently joined ECT after about 20 years of working in environmental restoration from the regulatory side. John will be providing some insight as to how you can put your best foot forward in working with government agencies that are going to have a role in setting priorities and in making recommendations for project funding. Okay, next, please. So, where we are now in the Restore Act process. Well, local committees, councils, and city and county administrators in coastal communities have been working to develop their own prioritized project lists and multi-year plans. They are working through such things as establishing their community spending priorities and deciding on what criteria they're going to use to evaluate candidate projects, making sure that they have adequate administrative infrastructure to manage projects once the money starts to move, because the one thing that's pretty evident just from the language of the Restore Act itself, even before we see the Treasury Department rules, is that there is going to be a significant administrative burden. Meanwhile, the Restore Council, long title being the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Council, on May 23rd published their draft initial comprehensive plan, which, when it becomes final, will be the Council's plan for expenditure of Pot 2 money. This plan is going to be focused on ecosystem restoration projects and programs which are going to be selected by the Restore Council. This particular pot of money is expected to favor regional efforts over local ones, but keep in mind if you have a good local ecosystem restoration project, you may be able to get it funded as part of a larger regional effort by partnering with others who want to do similar projects on the Gulf Coast. There is a 30-day formal public comment period currently underway, and it ends June 24th. One other point worth mentioning about the draft plan: the list of projects that was circulated with the draft plan is not the same as the initial 3-year prioritized projects list. There's been a lot of questions asked about that. Our understanding, and this is from this past Monday evening's meeting in Pensacola with the Restore Council, is that once the initial comprehensive plan is finalized, the Council will turn its focus to the initial 3-year list. Finally, the Florida Association of Counties Gulf Consortium is working with the counties to develop good projects for funding using Pot 3 money. And the Gulf Consortium has the responsibility for preparing Florida's state expenditure plan, which will be submitted to the Restore Council for approval. The Restore Act explicitly does allow for use of Pot 3 money for economic development-related projects, so the counties are understandably very interested in this particular funding stream. Regarding the U.S. Treasury Department rules, we heard recently that through Bill Nelson's office, Senator Bill Nelson's office, that they were expecting a draft to be available for review by the counties perhaps as soon as late May. We have not seen it yet, but that should be forthcoming if it's not yet available to the counties. A second draft is expected to follow sometime this summer for broader public comment. The BP civil trial continues, and it's in between phases at this point. Phase 2, I believe, is scheduled to start in mid-September, so that is, by all appearances, going to be a fairly lengthy process. But it's a very important process because, as most of you are probably aware, this is the process that will determine the ultimate fine amount to be assessed. That will provide the majority of the funding that's expected to go into the trust fund. As many folks are aware, one settlement has already happened, and that was a $1 billion fine amount that was determined as part of the Transocean settlement. So there is money already in the trust fund, but it cannot be dispersed yet. Next, please. Steps that people are taking now and can be taking now. These are some things that we're seeing stakeholders engaged in at the present time. Obviously, we talked about this a bit in our first webinar. A key thing that needs to happen, if it hasn't already in your local communities, is getting the local stakeholders organized, getting folks engaged in terms of public input, and talking with each other, helping to develop the priorities in your particular community, and they're going to obviously be unique for every community. As you do that, if it's done, pretty thoroughly and deliberately, some things are going to happen. You'll see some opportunities begin to emerge, and you'll see some challenges begin to emerge. And the important thing to take out of this process is to be able to get people to take ownership of action items. Your stakeholders, the folks that are committed to the process, will need to be encouraged and try and get commitments from folks to actually take ownership of an action item and begin to work on clearing the way for good projects, or making good projects better through capturing some of the opportunities that come into view. Next, please. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Edstrom at this point, and Jeff is going to share some insights from his work on some other large-scale natural resource restoration efforts that have been conducted previously, and some lessons learned that may have some applicability to the Gulf restoration effort. Jeff?
Thanks, Lee. My name is Jeff Edstrom, and I'm the manager of ECT's Chicago office, and I've been working on regional planning efforts in the Great Lakes. Over the last several years, we've been working on a number of projects related to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is a federal effort that's provided about $1 billion for restoration over 4 years through multiple agencies. It's required us to work with a number of clients and municipalities and nonprofits and other organizations to identify and develop projects that fit the overall criteria for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Next slide, please. As you can see, we cover a wide area of land here on the Great Lakes, and the U.S. side in particular here. And so we've had to work in different areas and look at different types of planning efforts throughout the GLRI's time span. Next slide, please. As we've looked through the different funding agencies and different programs and different requirements, we've had to work with clients and really try to solve a puzzle, a funding puzzle, where we're trying to find the best fit for funding for different projects, that through understanding the requirements that are there for each of the different federal agencies or even state agencies that are getting funding, in understanding their goals, and in particular making sure that as we're developing these projects and developing the proposals, we're engaging the public to get support for the projects, because that really helps to engage the community, as well as shows evidence that the project is really needed in that local area. Next slide, please. As with the Restore Act, we've had to look at different types of goals. In this case, there are 5 primary goals in terms of cleaning up toxics and areas of concern, of concern being some of the more contaminated sites around the Great Lakes, looking at combating invasive species and wetland and habitat restoration and nearshore health. As you can see, the funding has gone in different ways, giving particular emphasis to cleaning up toxics and as well as restoring wetlands and other habitats. However, some of these efforts do go across goals, particularly with habitat restoration and cleaning up toxics in areas of concern. So one of the things we've had to do is think across the different priorities and goals to make sure that we can show multiple benefits. Next slide, please. And we've had to look at it in a bigger context in terms of planning efforts for areas of concern. We have lake-wide management plans for each of the Great Lakes. We have local watershed plans that we have to fit them in with, coastal plans, as well as different types of transportation plans. So trying to show how each of the projects and proposals fits in with the broader context, both from the overall goals for the Great Lakes down to the local level. Next slide, please. Ultimately, we've had to identify those potential projects that meet those criteria for the different funding programs and make sure that, we get the best fit, because the funding is going through different agencies such as US EPA, NOAA, Department of Transportation, Department of Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. In all, there are 11 federal agencies that are involved, so it's trying to look across all of those to make sure that they fit those different funding mechanisms in the best way possible. And then identifying potential economic, environmental, and other impacts. Economic impacts have been of real concern as well, to make sure that this restoration effort is really going to help spur growth and development. Next slide, please. And we've worked on a wide range of project types: fishing piers, dam removals, lagoon habitat restorations, a whole host of different types of projects. In the first year for GLRI funding, we helped 14 different clients submit 14 different proposals, and of those, all 14 were funded. And we've had good success since that first year as well, but it's because we thought about the bigger picture and making sure that we met the requirements for each of the proposals. Next slide, please. In the years that followed, we started to work with some of the local areas of concern in developing information management systems, so that we could start to think much more clearly about what are the different types of projects that need to be done, and what are the environmental impairments that they need to address, and trying to be a lot more specific and much more detailed in terms of that for planning for future years, because that helps identify what are the best priorities. It also engages local stakeholders and the public in that process, so that you can get a better sense of what's needed. Next slide, please. And this is just a screen from one of the databases where we're looking at doing an evaluation criteria and starting to look at information management systems as a way to evaluate what's the status of impairments, as well as what projects need to be done. Next slide. Overall, among the lessons we learned was it's important to set those project priorities based on the funding mechanisms and making sure that they meet them clearly, and being very clear about how that project meets the funding goals, engaging the public, and really making sure that communities are prepared, because if you're prepared, you're more likely to get the funding. It's also necessary to understand that bigger context, and as time goes on, manage that project information, because the rules that apply in the first year may not apply in the second. And so you have to start to think ahead of time and look at where the funding mechanisms might be moving in the future, and positioning yourself to meet those in the future. And next slide. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Smith, where he talks about how you can assemble high-value regional projects. Jeff?
Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about some successful projects that ECT has completed with partnering agencies and multiple funding sources. Next slide, please. Our first case study, I'm going to detail some of our work developing and implementing wetland restoration projects at Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. For those that don't know, the refuge is located on the East Coast and contains the vast majority of salt marsh habitat in the Indian River Lagoon. But most of these wetlands were impounded in the mid-1900s to reduce salt marsh mosquito populations. Now, the impoundments were very effective at reducing mosquito populations, but also had significant adverse impacts to the wetlands. These impacts were so significant that the restoration and rehabilitation of these impounded wetlands was identified as a high priority project in the Indian River Lagoon Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan. And to help facilitate these restoration efforts, ECT was contracted by the St. Johns River Water Management District to work with the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop impoundment restoration plans that address multiple stakeholder objectives. Next slide, please. So when we were developing the restoration plans, our general approach was to start out conceptually and evolve the idea by incorporating input from multiple stakeholders. In the initial planning phases, we focused on outcomes that would be mutually beneficial for all stakeholders. We tried to demonstrate that restoring these impoundments has multiple benefits, not only ecologically and aesthetically, but it also improves the condition of the adjacent lagoon, which supports various recreational activities. And of course, we wanted the projects to be practical to implement and desirable to funding agencies. And to do that, we emphasized that the results of restoration would be highly visible and measurable. So as these plans were being developed, we prioritized them and moved forward with the projects that could be easily permitted and had a strong likelihood of being funded. And at that point, we finalized our technical approach to implementing the projects. Next slide, please. One of the projects we implemented was funded by the St. Johns River Water Management District with the support of the Fish and Wildlife Service and NASA. These photos were taken during the restoration of one of the impoundments and show how the levee was completely removed and the ditch was filled. These areas will quickly develop into salt marsh. And this is an after picture of that first one. And as you can see from this final picture, the native vegetation quickly establishes over the restored levee and borrow ditch areas. Next slide, please. Another project we implemented involved reconnecting impoundment to the lagoon by installing some water control structures. This project was funded by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission with the support of the Water Management District, Fish and Wildlife, and NASA. Historically, this area was directly connected to the lagoon before it was impounded in the 1960s. The levee isolated the system from the estuary, and it naturally converted to more of a freshwater system dominated by cattail and willow. Simply by reintroducing salt water, the system quickly reverted back to its historical conditions. This was a very inexpensive effort that allowed the land managers to still utilize the impoundment for mosquito control or for waterfowl habitat, while also providing a mechanism for rehabilitation of the marsh. Next slide, please. These projects were successful due to the planning and strong partnerships. Under this contract, ECT facilitated the development of 18 restoration plans and the implementation of 3 of those projects using 3 different funding sources. One of the projects was funded using Florida Department of Environmental Protection money as a method of permanent exotic control. Another was funded using Water Management District funds as part of their ongoing efforts outlined in their CCMP. And the third was funded by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission to promote fish passage into the impoundment. While these projects were being implemented, ECT worked with the partners to develop more plans and secure permits so that additional projects would be shovel-ready for future funding sources. Those shovel-ready projects in that permit package included the removal of over 18 miles of levee, the creation of nearly 120 acres of new salt marsh, and reconnecting over 1,100 acres of previously impounded marsh. And after our contract ended, the Water Management District and Fish and Wildlife Service were able to implement those projects when the funding from the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act became available. Next slide, please. Let's shift gears a little bit and take a look at another project that could potentially qualify for Restore Act funds. It's well known that excess nutrients in stormwater runoff can impair receiving water bodies. Oftentimes, in order to implement a pollution reduction project, you need data to assess the problem. In this case study, we illustrate a baseline data collection project that quantified nutrient loads from 2 large basins upstream of the GTM reserve near St. Augustine. This project was funded using an FDEP grant. The most recent GTM reserve management plan identified a need for improved basin management to address future development and the associated point and non-point source pollution that came along with it. To accomplish this, ECT developed a monitoring program to collect water quality and stream flow data that was used to develop storm event and base flow pollutant loads for these 2 catchments that drain to the reserve. Now, this data can be used to determine the scope and scale of treatment needed to maintain or improve water conditions in the reserve as future development occurs. Next slide, please. If the baseline data is already available and your pollutant sources have been identified, then a restoration or retrofit project can be implemented. And our next case study is an example of how pollutants in stormwater runoff can be intercepted before they enter a receiving water body. The 27th Avenue project in New Smyrna Beach historically discharged stormwater runoff carrying gross pollutants and nutrients directly to the Indian River Lagoon. ECT helped the city acquire funding through the 319H grant program to implement a retrofit project. Now, the basin is located in a residential area adjacent to a city nature preserve. We designed a pretreatment sedimentation basin that captured litter and sediment from stormwater before discharging to an offline infiltration area. And to measure the effectiveness of the project, we conducted monitoring and determined that the system was able to capture and infiltrate up to a 1-inch storm event while removing 100% of gross pollutants and up to 90% of nutrients. Next slide, please. In summary, I want to talk about some of the key elements that made these projects I just talked about successful. By far, planning was the most important factor in moving these projects to the implementation phase. We started the planning process by identifying needs outlined in regional management or action plans. We gathered or collected baseline data to identify the problem and outline multiple benefits that could result from restoration. The success criteria were well defined and measurable. We used multiple partners and funding sources to strengthen our projects because the more support we had, the more favorable the projects were to regulatory or funding agencies. In many cases, these projects would not have moved forward without stakeholder collaboration. And finally, we were ready. For the Merritt Island work in particular, we had a binder full of projects that were sitting on the shelf that were permitted and shovel ready. And even after our contract ended, those projects plans were implemented by the stakeholders when the funding became available. These were some of the key components that proved successful for our projects and our steps we would implement working with our clients in the future. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to John Abendroth to talk about what you can do to increase your chances of your project being funded. John?
All right, thank you, Jeff. And again, my name is John Abendroth. And before joining ECT, I was an administrator with FDEP for a number of years. And in those positions, I oversaw the development of BMAPs, managed the 319 grant program, and was involved in the review of funding requests through the Watershed Grant Program and legislative appropriation requests. Now, although I no longer work for the state of Florida, and so I can't speak for the state as to exactly how projects proposed for funding in this process will be reviewed, based on my past experience, I can provide some insight into how projects have been reviewed in those other programs and the types of things that state and federal reviewers typically look for in those proposals. Next slide, please. And as I take you through some of the things that agencies typically look for in projects to be recommended and selected for funding, you'll notice that the projects that have been discussed by our previous 2 presenters encompass a number of those themes, and those efforts did receive grant funding. So these factors are important for the reviewing agencies. One of the first things that jump out at reviewers is which projects offer the best bang for the buck. And for this, you want to be able to provide some projects with strong water quality and habitat benefits, and particularly benefits to impaired water bodies. And although matching funds are not required in this funding process, you can strengthen your project through partnerships and match funds. Another item reviewers look for are whether projects offer multiple benefits. For example, does your project include more than one type of environmental or water quality component, such as for stormwater treatment, low-impact design, habitat improvement, and so forth? And also, along with providing for environmental benefits, does the project offer any economic, recreational, or educational benefits that add more things into your project, more benefits for the reviewers to consider? Are your projects shovel-ready versus or longer term? In this process, you'll want to look at projects ready to go immediately, as well as to begin developing projects for that longer term, that 10-year plan that's always talked about. And it's good to have some projects ready to take immediate use of available funds, and you may want to consider phased projects rather than having single, complete, larger projects. So you can always jump in when money is available and do parts of your projects and move along slowly to get them completed. Are the project proposals detailed and complete? It's easier for reviewers to consider project proposals that are clear on what the project is accomplishing and how they'll go about it. This provides the reviewers with some certainty as to what you're getting for the money. Invisible results are something that we've noticed as being of interest to both agencies and legislative bodies. There's a large amount of money that's being put out for this funding effort, and so there's certainly going to be lots of scrutiny as to how the funds are being spent. And so we'll need to see tangible results to be able to show off to both the public and to the agencies and Congress and all of those. All right, next slide, please. Reviewers also look to see that projects are consistent with funding criteria and the goals and objectives of the funding program. This again goes to the issue discussed earlier regarding focusing and scaling your project to the funding source. The Restore Act funding has three main pots of funds that you're likely to be interested in, each with its own slightly different objectives, and you need to fit your projects within those objectives. The Gulf Restoration Council recently put out their draft initial comprehensive plan, as Lee mentioned earlier, and that begins to provide more information as to their priorities. And FDEP on its website also provides a list of state priorities for projects to be put forward for funding by the Council. And more information will continue to come out from the Council, FDEP, and the Gulf Consortium as this process moves forward. So take a look at your own projects. Are they locally oriented versus a regional orientation? Are they small or very large projects? Do they just have an environmental benefit, an economic benefit, or a combination of both? So determine which funding mechanism best fits your project and develop your project to meet the requirements for that source. Also, are your projects consistent with other applicable laws and rules? An example would be, are there permitting issues or conflicts with other matched funding sources that might hinder completion of your project? If reviewers have any concerns about the viability of your proposal, they may pass it over for funding another project. And then finally, are the projects identified in, or do they complement local, regional, or state plans? This helps to demonstrate that your project fits in with the bigger picture and that it has public support. All right, next slide, please. Regional planning is definitely important in this process and has very clearly been identified as such by the Council. And a good example of a recent planning effort is the recently developed Southwest Florida Regional Ecosystem Restoration Plan. So why is this such a good example? Well, it has a large regional coverage. It included significant public involvement throughout the process of developing the plan. They developed selection criteria and a scoring process. You had a very open and rigorous process for what projects to consider in this plan. And they matched and reviewed projects against the Restore Act goals and regional ecosystem plans. And it included both short-term and long-term projects. Now, you don't necessarily need to go to this level of effort, but as mentioned earlier, it does help to show that your project is consistent with local and regional objectives. And if you don't want to develop a new plan like this, you may wish to consider a tie-in to other existing regional plans, such as SWIM plans, BMAPs, or other large-scale restoration plans in your area. All right, next slide, please. So just to summarize some suggestions for you to consider while you're developing and planning your projects, one is to join with others in a regional plan. Again, this demonstrates regional benefits and public support, that these plans have all been vetted by the public. And just like regional planning is important, the Council and the Act itself have identified public involvement is very important in this process. Look for partners and match. It allows for bigger projects with greater benefits over a larger area. And remember that with all the money that's coming into this process, and it is quite large, that it is also limited. And having match funds in your project allows you to pull less from the funding pot at any one time. Consider maximizing the benefits resulting from your projects. And include different types of things, different types of environmental benefits, include some recreational and educational parts to your project as well. And plan for both short-term and long-term projects. And last slide, please. Finally, scale and focus your projects to the targeted funding source. This is your best chance to shine. Be sure that the projects are eligible and fit within the criteria of the Council's comprehensive plan, the state objectives, the Gulf Consortium, and the Restore Act. Next slide. And again, that goes to what I was just speaking about. You have, the direct state allocations to the counties, the money that's going to the council for selecting projects, and the funds that are going to the Gulf Consortium. So decide, look at what each of the priorities are for these pots, and fit your project into one that seems to match your project the best. And now I'll turn this back to Lee Smith to provide some final thoughts.
Thanks, John. Well, thanks for joining us in today's webinar. Some things we've talked about. We've shown you some proven principles that can help you develop good fundable projects and regional restoration programs. Some Florida-specific examples of collaborative restoration efforts using multiple funding sources, and some insights into how to work successfully with state oversight agencies to make sure your projects are conceived in a way that looks appealing to the funding decision makers at the state level. To conclude, here are a few things that you can be doing as the Restore Act process moves forward to help you get your best and most important projects funded. First of all, stay informed. We do have some outlets for providing information to you. RestoreTheGulf.gov is another good one, and we encourage you to utilize those. Next, please. Secondly, stay engaged in whatever ways are the best fit for you. If you're working at a county level, you already know about the work of the Gulf Consortium, very active, and we encourage you to stay in touch with what they're doing and to make sure that you're receiving Doug Darling's email updates as well. Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Council is currently back on a public engagement tour, and they're having a series of meetings to hear what people have to say about the draft initial plan, initial comprehensive plan. There are folks at a number of different state agencies that are soliciting input. Use your contacts there, find out who the right person is to be talking with, and make sure that they're aware of your good projects that you want to try and get funded. And finally, be plugged in at the local level. There is a window of time here because of the delay in the Treasury Department rules that gives the communities and the local Restore councils and committees in the communities a little more time to get their basically get the wagons circled and get their plans polished up as far as what their local priorities are going to be. Next. Finally, call us. We'll be glad to help you with questions that you may have relative to the things you've heard today, and we'll be glad to talk with you about how you can take projects from a concept to a good fundable proposal at your level and through whatever avenues are most appropriate for your project. You're welcome to reach out to anybody on the call today. If you want to talk to somebody whose number is not up here, call me. I'll be glad to put you in touch with them.